Welcome to the MyWorkDrive Server Setup and Admin Guide. In this video, we will be reviewing MyWorkDrive Server setup and configuration of all components including authentication, storage, shares, and security functionality. Let's dive in.
I want to start just by mentioning some important distinctions between version 7 and our earlier server versions, and that's really the introduction of the ability to use Entra as an identity provider, so you don't need an Active Directory and domain controllers, and the introduction of connections to Azure Storage with API. Previously, all of our connections to storage had either been SMB with NTFS permissions or the connections that we use to OneDrive and SharePoint, but we've now got connections to Azure Storage. So let's get into setting up your server. Of course, you've downloaded from our website. We'll have chapters and links to the articles we mentioned in the notes on this video down below. So feel free to jump around, follow along, click off to the things you need. And of course, a link to our support site. I actually have our support site up here because I want to start talking about a little bit of the setup, the initial setup of a MyWorkDrive server. Whether you're using Active Directory or Entra as your identity provider and which storage you use. We'll get into a lot of that in the course of this video, but regardless of that, we still have some basic requirements around server sizing, which we have a guide to help you figure out, since that is variable in your environment based on network performance and storage location and things of that nature, antivirus requirements, and also the operating systems that are required of your server, whether or not your domain joined or not. And we really go into that through our setup portal, our server setup guide, and then the other articles that we have along in here. And like I say, we'll link to these things in the video description. I mentioned briefly the fact that we've got this new, I'll start essentially with the fact that we've now got the ability to choose whether you want the traditional Active Directory mode, which we've supported from the beginning of our product and continue to support. Don't get the idea that Active Directory is not an option in version 7. It certainly is fully supported for upgrades and new installs. It's just that we now also offer Entra ID. And so you can see here in this picture a little bit of the description of kind of some of the differences. The big difference, of course, is whether you have or need Active Directory and those underlying NTFS permissions versus being able to use Entra ID user sign-in. From a user experience standpoint, the product works the same. Your users don't need to know anything different about how to use MyWorkDrive, whether you're in Active Directory or Entra for identity. The users will still sign in. If you're in Active Directory, of course, you get a domain sign-in or an SSO provider. With Entra ID, you're purely using that Microsoft native login, which, again, to the users looks exactly the same. The other important distinction is, I mentioned we now offer storage API connections to Azure Storage, Azure File Shares, and Azure Blob. There are some differences between what's available between Active Directory mode and Entra mode, essentially whether or not you're able to use Entra ID as an identity option or whether you have to give share level access or container level access with a SAS token or a connection string. And we'll get into the details on that as we go through the setup portion with Entra ID. The very first thing you really need to know is that when you install MyWorkDrive, there's a prompt. And that's your point in time where you choose whether you're going to use Active Directory. My screen here says Azure Active Directory. Of course, it's now Entra. Or traditional Active Directory. Now that traditional Active Directory might be on-prem, it might be in the cloud, it might be a domain controller in the cloud, it might be a hosted AD mode like Entra Active Directory Domain Services or another provider's AD emulator if you're in another cloud provider. But concept being, you're going to make that choice here during install. And the reason that choice is in install is because foundationally it defines how the server makes connections and what options we need to present to you. So there's no option to switch between those two choices except at the point of install. The other key distinction is if you're an existing customer and you're upgrading a server, you're not presented this option. In order to move essentially or migrate to an Entra ID model, you do a clean install. And I think as you see, we go through this video, you'll see why that's so important because so many of the options and selections just are so much different, right? The selection of users in the granular permissions on the file shares and the setup of the connections to various integrations are all quite a bit different.
Yeah, the only thing
So
I might mention here is just as a reminder is that if you're in Active Directory mode, doesn't mean that you can't log in with Entra ID. We've always supported that through SAML, right? So what Scott is talking about here is native Entra ID, also known as Azure Active Directory. And in that case, then you would be logging in natively, no SAML setup required, which can be a little bit more complex to be able to set up, but by using Entra ID, you're actually logging in natively, and there would be no domain controllers required, which is we've heard from a lot of customers. They really don't want to have to manage a domain controller. They want to go full cloud. Then they could run a MyWorkDrive server up in Azure as a virtual machine, point to storage, point to Entra ID, and that's kind of the use case there. They might also do it on-prem. It may be a smaller company. They don't want to deal with having anything on premise and from a domain controller standpoint, but maybe they've already got an Office 365 login for all their users. They could use that and point it to local storage. That would be another potential use case. But again, you can still do that all with single sign-on, SAML integration, Okta, Azure AD, so on and so forth. That has not changed. This is just another option.
The only real prerequisite installing, of course, we talked about server sizing and things like that, but the one key to remember if you're installing in Active Directory mode is that the server be domain joined, right? So you go through, you're going to choose that, I'm installing in Active Directory mode during the setup wizard. There's lots of other prompts in the setup or in the installer. I'm not going to go through all of them, but this is the key one, the key sort of difference, and it's important to understand the distinction here as we talk about the two different paths within our product. Once you choose that, you answer all the questions, you get to sign in, then that, like I say, the one real prerequisite that always stands is that the server needs to be domain joined for Active Directory. Now, of course, Entra ID, you don't need that. And all the prerequisites that we require are listed here in the server setup guide. I'm not going to go through all of them because we spent half an hour just talking about those things. But the key of them are all in our server setup guide, which is on our support website. It's actually the middle box at the top row if you go on our support site. So super easy to find, and it'll be linked in the description. But once you've got the server installed, you get prompted to go through the wizard. I'm not going to go through the Active Directory wizard because that's pretty easy. Essentially, it's publishing your site to the internet. It's connecting to your shares. But I do want to talk about connecting to shares because that's an important part of what's different between Active Directory and Entra as an identity provider. So here, this server already has a list of shares on it. You can see a variety of Azure shares as well as local shares. But if I were to add a new one, now anyone who's an existing customer, this looks familiar, and it's relatively unchanged. In 6.4, we added the storage type option, and the storage type option now includes a couple new ones. But very familiar interface. No significant changes there if you're an existing customer. If you're a new customer, adding share is pretty easy. You're going to give this thing a name. Now, the name field is the label. That's what users see. It's not tied to the identity of the share, or the permissions, or anything of that nature, but the path is. And you should know what your share's path is to drop it in here because this has to work. Now, if you don't know what it is, of course, just pop open File Explorer, browse to it, copy and paste to make that stuff easy. If you have drive letter options enabled, you can pick the appropriate drive letter. If you don't, this field won't show up, so don't worry. That's not an error in your part if you don't have it. Of course, I have some options turned on in the server here, which we're going to talk about sort of the common options in the latter half of the video. I just want to get through sort of the core differences really between Active Directory and Entra ID. But what's different here, and this is the important distinction, is really when I import, the server is using the underlying NTFS permissions, and of course, I didn't give it a drive letter, so it didn't enable the mapper client, but that's easy to change. The server is importing your existing NTFS permissions that are already on that share that you've defined right on the file server. You of course have the ability to change these, right? I can say, well, these people don't actually need access via MyWorkDrive. And this is really a security feature. It's meant to limit and control access so I can get this back to a base level of groups. And of course, with our granular permissioning, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later, you can adjust the features that are available to the different groups as you need, as it's important. But what's happening here and what's important to understand is that all of the access on this file share, because I'm in Active Directory mode, is occurring in the context of the user. So the user signs into the machine. I know what groups they're a member of. I know what they have rights to. So when the user accesses in any of the clients, doesn't matter what client you're using, MapDrive, mobile web, Mac, Windows, iOS, Android, none of that matters. It all works the same way. When the user accesses the share, it's done under the context of the user. And so that's important to understand because that's what happens in Active Directory mode. So when you want that absolute finite granular permission of this user has access to this file and this other user it's read only and this other user doesn't have access at all and this other user has full control, that's all going to carry forward when the user signs in via MyWorkDrive. Now, what's can be misleading about this interface is if you click out to edit, it gives you a list of everything that's available in your Active Directory. And of course, we only show the first 100 users. You can search for anything else you want. I can go in here and do something that's not necessarily true, right? I could grant Samantha access to this share. Samantha now shows up in the list, give her all the permissions in MyWorkDrive. But if that isn't true in NTFS permissions, if you haven't actually given Samantha access or Samantha isn't a member of one of the groups you've defined, you're not actually granting her access to anything. And that's really important to understand that we're using those underlying NTFS permissions.
Yeah, we've always said in the past we can take permissions away, in Active Directory mode, but we can't grant them, right? So we can, and that's a little bit going to be a little bit different as we get into Entra ID.
Correct. The last thing I'll mention important in understanding one of the core features that's slightly different in Active Directory mode and what you'll have different in Entra mode. And when you add shares, if you enable a SAML SSO, right, over here in Enterprise, I have SAML SSO required turned on. So my users are going to get that Microsoft login experience in this case because I've chosen Entra, but I could have chosen Okta or OneLogin or a manual SAML and done anybody I wanted. Ping Identity or Google or anybody else for that matter. Your shares require delegation to be configured on Active Directory so that the MyWorkDrive server can impersonate the user and operate in the context of the user. The concept of delegation doesn't exist with Entra ID or Entra as an identity provider. So when you do that, if your share does not have delegation configured, you'll get a little warning on here that says you need to enable delegation with a click off to an article, which is in our support site. Of course, we'll link to that as it keeps saying, but you can search for that. There's a lot of ways to set delegation, so I don't want to go through them all here on this call. You can see how easy the search is to use on our site because there's a lot of different models between setting it with constrained delegation or Kerberos delegation or DFS, Azure Files, PowerShell model. Just be aware that that's a difference that exists, and you'll get a cool tooltip about it in here. I should have broken one intentionally so you could see the tooltip, so shame on me. But you get a tooltip in here which you can actually click, and there's actually a routine built into MyWorkDrive that will attempt to do it for you. The security in your Active Directory may or may not prevent that to function, but you can always go back and do that manually. So at this point, I think I'd like to invite Dan to present and get into
one other
the work on
thing would be
Entra.
good, Scott, before you switch over to me, is log out of the admin panel because I want to talk about how you log into the admin panel when it's Entra ID.
Good point. Good point.
So notice the login here, it says username is domain, and then, administrator has to be someone who can at least be an administrator on the box. ID in domain administrator, of course, would have that. Scott's going to log in. He's going to log in as a domain account to do the administration. So then when he's doing things on here, like browsing out to shares to go and import permissions and things like that, he's doing it all within that context. As he said, the machine has to be domain joined. So some of that is going to change when we get into Entra ID mode in a second. So I just wanted to point that out because sometimes people get confused as, how do I log into this thing? What are my users? Okay, great. Let's switch over. I've got a machine over here in that regard that I've already set up. And now that machine is not domain joined. And once I've installed the MyWorkDrive server setup, as Scott showed. In fact, if you're not domain joined, by default, it's going to prompt you to do Azure AD Entra ID mode. It knows that it's not domain joined, so it assumes that you're going to want to do it that way. If it is domain joined, it'll automatically select Active Directory mode. So then the first question becomes, again, how do I log in? So think about from the control panel standpoint for MyWorkDrive that this is just sort of a configuration tool, right? So the MyWorkDrive web server needs to have a way to be able to administer things that you're turning off and on. And so think of this as sort of a front end for that to be able to make those changes that it needs to make. It's no longer acting as the user when you log in and immediately integrating in that way. And it's a big change in terms of the way the MyWorkDrive server functions, because it's not going to be able, you cannot take the MyWorkDrive server and say, oh, I can impersonate user so-and-so. No, they're actually going to be going directly out with a token to Azure file shares or blob file shares and things like that. Or in some cases, if you're pointing to storage, it may just actually, you may be just giving that information to MyWorkDrive connection string, and then we're validating, yep, that's the user that they're trying to log in with, and they're in the group that they're supposed to be in to get the share. And so the MyWorkDrive server is sort of the gatekeeper to determine whether or not they get that share, but there may not be any underlying permissions involved. So first thing I'm going to do is log in. This is a standalone machine. And this machine was set up. It hasn't even been configured yet. And so what we're going to do to start is, what happens is initially it's going to come up with the wizard. And this wizard will come up because it notices that I don't have Entra ID authentication at all. And so that you can't work unless that's set up. And so what that's going to require is that you be able to set up an app registration. You need to have permissions to be able to do that in Azure and your Entra ID. And you can either use our MyWorkDrive hosted app registration if you're going to use our myworkdrive.net domain, or we'll prompt you in a second here to create one for you. So that, and we even have all the permissions in there. But that's the first step, is to, and a lot of other vendors would say, here's the instructions on our site, go and create app registration and come back when you're done. We've actually created a wizard for you to be able to do that for you. It automatically fills in all the permissions. All you have to do is authenticate. But just understand there's two different ways to be able to do the app registration. You can either use the myworkdrive.net domain and use our app registration and approve that to be able to work on your site as an app registration in Entra ID, or we'll create one for you, and you approve our app that allows it to be able to create it. So it's a little confusing in that case, because you're actually approving the MyWorkDrive app to create an app for you, right? And that app only has permission to create that one thing. And when it's done, you can remove that. But so sometimes it can be a little confusing for people. So let's get started here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and choose the myworkdrive.net domain. Give it a name, put today's date in or something like that. And this information here is only used to notify you that the site is up. This is not a marketing or anything like that. This is just to let you know, hey, your site's ready to go. So you don't have to worry about putting that in there. At that point, we're going to go out and create a Cloudflare reverse proxy connection. And there's support information on our site all about Cloudflare. You need to have some outbound ports allowed. If those are blocked, you'll need to fix those. Otherwise, you do have an option to set up manually and use your own host name and set up your own SSL certificate. It's standard IIS website. So if you know how to set up an IIS website and install an SSL certificate and do a host name, You can do all that even before you get to this point, and just go ahead and set that up and open up the port that you need and run it through your firewall or WAF or whatever it is that you want to do. This,
I think that's two important distinctions. If I could interrupt real quick. One, the method of publishing the site is the same, regardless of, making your site available. I call it publishing because typically it's an internet facing, but it doesn't have to be. Obviously, you can use it internally. But in air quotes, um, publishing to the internet is the same regardless of version. The one difference that happens with Entra ID is we asked for it earlier in the process, of course, because we need to be able to use it to define how we connect to um, that app that gets posted in Azure. So it does get prompted earlier in the process now, and is more of a requirement, but it's in all regards unchanged from how you publish, whether it's Entra or Active Directory for
yeah,
the
that's right. We have to
identity.
have a host name, right? Especially with Entra, right? There's, I mean, we've had some people in the past maybe just use it on the local area network and just do port 80 or something like that, and it's in a lockdown scenario, so they're fine with that. In this case, you're using Entra ID, so we have to have a public address. This port here is what it needs to remain there. Don't ever take that away because we use that for a couple different scenarios with the Cloudflare stuff. If you were to go ahead and create your own host name, because it's the same as you always would do, you would just put that in here, put in your host name, select your SSL certificate. We have support docs, and there's a million of them out there on how to create an SSL certificate and install an IS. I'm not going to get into that here, but that just to understand that this is just standard IS. If you know how to do an IS website, you know how to do an SSL certificate, it's pretty easy, and we have a lot of help on that too, and support docs on that.
And if you're just getting started, just testing it out, I certainly use the Cloud Web Connector option. It's easy,
Yeah,
simple.
and
Yeah.
that's one of the reasons we put it there, right? Because a lot of people want to just trial something and get it going. So in this case, notice I have a couple options here. I can set up manually. I can set up automatically. So, if I set up manually, what that means is you'll have gone to the site already. You'll have already created the app registration manually, gone through and added all the permissions and granted all the permissions, and you can do that. And we have got a support articles on our site exactly what you need to do that. I'm going to go ahead and say I want to set up automatically. The first thing I have to do is log in to Azure AD in order to be able to do that. So in order to do that, since this site is not even on the internet yet, we have to go through an extra step. So I'm going to copy this code as it says here. Then I'm going to log in to Azure AD. So I'm going to paste that code just to get started.
And of course, here you're signing in with a user who has administrative rights to Azure. And this is a standard Microsoft login with standard multi-factor and conditional access policies.
Yeah, just go ahead and accept that. It says you may now close the window. Okay. All right, so I'm done with that. And notice I now can continue. Here's the point at which you can either have it create one for you or use our hosted app. Since I'm using the MyWorkDrive net domain on the reverse proxy, I can just use the Entra ID app that we've already created for you, but there's certain permissions that we need for that. So you'll be prompted here to click approve before you can get to the next step. If I want to create my own, and I'm going to go ahead and do that just because I think it's a lot of customers may want to do that just from the extra level of security standpoint. In this case, I'm going to give it a name.
A lot of customers might be required to create their own because they may have tenant restrictions which prevent using third-party apps. So if you know that you have that restriction, don't even try to use the MyWorkDrive hosted app. Just go straight to creating it. And as Dan mentioned, this will do it for you. So super
Yeah,
simple.
you don't have to change the name. We of course do a billion of them in QA, so we try to put some names in here like who's here, and can we delete all these because we'll end up wanting a million app registrations in our QA domain. So notice it automatically knows that it's using your Cloud Web Connector web address, right? And optionally, if you want to be able to allow users to edit an Office 365, we can add those permissions into your app registration as well. So the first thing I need to do is click approve. And as I said earlier, now I'm going to be prompted to approve our app that only just does those couple things, right? It just grants us the ability to create the app for you. It isn't going in and allowing all kinds of other crazy things. And as I said, if that is a concern, you can remove that, even this permission, after it's done. But it's a special app that we created just called MyWorkDrive app that just is a sort of a jumper app to create your app that you will ultimately use. Okay, so that's completed. At this point, now it's just going to go and just check to see if it's out there. It found it. It's good to go. At this point, we should be good. And then we'll need to approve our own app at the end. It is going to show the application secret. Don't worry, we'll delete this one from our QA before we post this video, if anyone's wondering. But it is important if you want to, it's a good point for you to back up that information in a secure location as well. We do our best to back up MyWorkDrive configs for you if you want us to do that. That's one of the settings in the setup. At this point, here we go. So at this point now, I'm going to go ahead and approve it. And notice the app that I'm approving is the one that I created. It has that really long title. And now it's got a lot more permissions, right? Because in this case, the Entra ID app that you're creating is going to be able to go out and access storage on behalf of users and read and write files and look them up and all of that. Doesn't mean that you have to necessarily use all those permissions. We get into storage, you'll see that in some cases you can just log them in as a token as the user. So I'm going to go ahead and accept that. And again, I'm completed. And as soon as this comes back as approved, then I can move on to a couple last steps and I'll be fully functional. As I said earlier, Entra ID is so important that you really can't do anything in terms of, with MyWorkDrive when you're in Entra ID mode unless this is functional. So we won't even want to let you get past this step until that's operational. And if you did want to change your domain name or host name, you'll need to reset up this Entra ID because your app registration has a URL associated with it. So you'll actually need to reset that portion up and use the new host name or edit the app registration that we created for you just a second ago to put in that new host name. So you might start off with myworkdrive.net and then you end up wanting to, okay, I think this is a great product. I want to go ahead and put my own SSL certificate and host name in here. That's good, but you'll need to go back to Entra ID in Azure and edit the URL portion to put in the new host name there instead of using the myworkdrive.net host name that we created for you a minute ago.
Yeah, we make it easy in MyWorkDrive when you edit the Entra ID app. That'll be in integrations. Of course, Dan's now created one going through the wizard. We make it easy to automatically detect and change that URL, but as Dan says, you do have to make sure you change it in Azure on your app.
So a couple other options here. If your users are using OneDrive, that's an option for both Office Online editing. There's 2 or 3 other options that we'll go through in a minute as well. By default, that's an option. So if users want to be able to edit files in the browser while keeping them stored on your own storage. You can use OneDrive. If they want to use OneDrive as maybe a home drive replacement and still have department shares with MyWorkDrive, we also support that as well. We also have the ability to, create a share here on the fly using an Azure connection string. I'm not going to do that right now. We'll get into that when we look at the various options, and there's lots of different choices around depending on your security requirements and how you want users to be able to log in and maybe where your server is located as well. So I'm going to continue to the next step. We do have some ability to, limit map drive size for files and things like that. I'm not going to do anything there either. Okay, success. I'm now back to the admin panel, and I've successfully created a login, and you can see I have a couple shares to start. We give you a demo share on C, so immediately I would have gotten an email saying, here's your new web address. We have a couple of groups that we created that are sort of dummy groups called all Entra ID members and all Entra ID guests. So from a trial standpoint, you should be able to log in to your MyWorkDrive server immediately as soon as you get that email from our support, and you'll be able to be good to go. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Scott, who will start getting into some of our options around storage.
Thanks, Dan. Let me share my server again. So where I'd like to start is the fact that with Entra, again, we're continuing on our Entra ID and the new functionality in version 7. Where I'd like to start is the fact that there's a lot of different options when it comes to storage. You can use SMB. Now, in Entra ID, that's with a user pass, or what we internally sort of refer to as service mode. I'll show you how to do that in just a moment. And then you've got all the various Azure files options. Now, I'm not going to bore you going through every little thing in this chart. There's lots of different options in here. Just know that you've got, and of course, this is an article that I'll link in the video description. But you've got the option of Azure files via API or via SMB, right? We've always supported Azure files over SMB, and that doesn't go away. It's still totally available if you need that granular level permissioning. Otherwise, you've got Azure files. And the key element here is really the level at which you're able to control user access to those shares between Azure files, Azure Blob, SMB, Azure files with SMB, etc. So really, if I hone in on Azure storage, the important thing here is, and we get this from a lot of feedback from customers about, well, I need that file and folder level granular permission. Okay, so essentially your two options there are SMB with NTFS or Azure Blob with hierarchical namespace enabled using the access control list functionality. And I'm going to show you a little bit about that as we go through this conversation. But there's an important decision point there. If you haven't already migrated to Azure files, you haven't already migrated to some storage, and you're looking at what your options are, or maybe you did migrate and you're looking for other options, it's really important to think about the differences here about how you allow sign-in. Is it at the account level? Is it at the granular file and folder level? And then essentially how are you getting into it, whether that's connection string or SAS token or the various options that we support. Again, this is sort of a truncated version of just simply what you get as far as access level within the various Azure storage options. But then we have the big chart with all the different functionality, file sizes and performance and et cetera on our file storage article.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out too, if you go back to that chart for a second, just sort of as a talking point. Now this is based on the architecture of Azure file shares. This is not a MyWorkDrive issue, right? This is just simply what's available to us in the API, what can be done. Think about it this way. Azure file shares was set up with SMB and NTFS permissions that you could use like Azure File Share Sync in order to be able to get those permissions up there, which means you're always going to be using Kerberos. You're going to always require a domain controller, or you can have Microsoft host an active directory for you that basically is, what do they call it, Azure AD DS.
Yeah, it's now
which is domain.
Entra
It's
Domain
basically like a
Services.
dummy domain in Active Directory, right? That you don't really have full control over, but it will suffice, right? But that's another thing that you have to pay for, another thing that you have to worry about. And what we've heard some feedback from is when we've tried to set it up, at least with MyWorkDrive, is that it's slow. And so by using the API, we're able to do it much faster on lower, cheaper storage. The trade-off with Azure file shares, however, is that we can only really offer share level permissions. So you can set up a share in MyWorkDrive, and a lot of people do this. The marketing share, we're not going to go in and put in individual file and folder level permissions for that, right? And so in that case, that's perfectly fine. So Azure File Shares might work with our API for those customers perfectly well. But then there's a lot of other customers that maybe want to do a lift and shift scenario, and they want to have that level of individual file and folder permissions. And that is available through Azure Blob Storage using Data Lake with hierarchical namespace extension. And we do support that as well. So it's kind of a long list of ways that we created. That's why it took us so long to come out with this version, is because we do support multiple scenarios, and we also support a very high level of security if that's a requirement for customers to be able to implement MyWorkDrive to be able to access that storage as well.
Let me start by backing up and talking about the easiest one first, which is SMB. Now, I'm going to pop over to a different server that has, it does have some shares already defined in it. We're going to add some new ones here in a minute. At least one. They're essentially what I showed you earlier when I demonstrated adding a share on Active Directory and just importing the NTFS permissions. As I mentioned, it's all relatively similar, except with Entra ID, we more heavily leverage the use of our integrations tab and defining how you connect to storage. With Active Directory, we had a default domain join machine. It connected to storage via the domain, right? Traditional networking ports. With Entra ID mode, we need to define what storage is available and how we connect to it. Now, you don't have to go to integrations. You can actually do it just through shares. But I want to point out that integrations is here because if you need to do any maintenance on these, if you need to make a change to something you have configured, you've got to click into modify settings to change that in order to see what's there. If your storage, if your container name changes or the connection string you've defined changes or something like that, you would make those changes in integrations, because what you do in shares is define essentially, again, our name, right? What its storage connection is, which you've probably already defined these in integrations, but if you haven't, you can add one. And of course, we would pick the one we want to use. We'll just use the demo share. You'll notice that it renamed my share, but of course you can always override that. And now notice there's no import button because we don't have those underlying NTFS permissions to leverage anymore. So this is an important change and an important distinction between what happens in version 7 with Entra ID mode and Active Directory, because now you've got to define from your Entra directory what you want, like what you saw Dan do with the wizard earlier. And of course, I could pick that Entra ID, all Entra ID members group that Dan mentioned. But you can also search for and pick any group that you have defined out there. In this case, maybe I want this QA storage read and write group. Now, what I've done is I've essentially given access to all of the members of this group because we're using a service account, and you didn't actually see me do that because I picked it from the list, but that's part of that integration tool where when I create a connection to storage, and I'll go ahead and let this finish and save because we now have it in our list. When I create that connection to storage, I modify, I click add. This is where I'm defining, right? Local would be on the MyWorkDrive server itself, so we can use the local system account. The name of the share, probably kind of did this out of order. The share path, and what username and password I want to access under, right? So this is why I mentioned earlier a service account. Essentially, I'm defining what user is going to make this access. Might be myself. It's probably some sort of, as we mentioned, some sort of service account. And we're going to do a validation check to make sure that you've entered information which is correct. If we can't connect, we're obviously going to fail on that. So that's that two-step process, which I unfortunately did out of order. Maybe we'll re-record that and clean it up. But you're going to have a connection to that SMB storage with a service account, which you're then going to add in shares. And the users you define, have so many of them that fell to page 2, are who you're actually going to give access to. Now, these users will only have the access equivalent to the user you define on integrations, the service account, if you will. So if you give a service account, if you give the user, you define the service account that has access to that share is a read-only user, even though my group is called read-write, the users won't actually have write permissions because they are still using, akin to what we had with the Active Directory and NTFS model, they're still only using the actual permissions that they have to the share. You're not giving them more than they can actually have on with the MyWorkDrive interface, but you're defining who has access to that share. I muddled through that really badly. Now, the SMB configuration is the simplest of them because once you get into the others, Azure Files or Azure Blob, it gets a little bit more complicated, not just because you have to be able to do that work in Azure, but also because you have to basically set up your connections to that storage in Azure as well. So let's start with that. You saw Dan with the Azure Files configuration, but essentially you're going to have an Azure file share and you're going to have connection options to this share. You can either use a connection string, or you can use an Entra ID auth, which essentially the user will be prompted to authenticate and get an Entra ID token when they attempt to access that share on the client. Now, in most cases, that will be totally seamless because they've already signed in with that native Microsoft login. They have an active Microsoft session. They're probably never going to even see a prompt to it. They're just going to authenticate. But behind the scenes, technologically, when they go to click on that share that you've defined as an Entra ID share as opposed to a connection string or something, it's going to validate their user account. And why that's important is because, and why I'm on this screen is that's dependent on the user's role assignment. So you notice I have a share defined in a storage account called AFS EID. Look, I'll go back to the top of my storage just so you can see how that works. Right. I have a number of storage accounts in this Azure tenant, but I have that Azure Files EID share, right? And it's got all its permissions, right? All the things that you would set up when you go through and set up a new Azure Files storage account, the access tier and et cetera. But if you choose Entra ID mode, we're dependent on the role assignment. So the user's got to have a role assignment. And there are a couple, 3 or 4 role assignments which are valid for this. The one that we've chosen is data file or storage file data privilege contributor, which is the equivalent of modify. They're not an owner, but they have more than simply read, right? So you want to make sure you're very careful about picking. And there's a role level equivalent for essentially all 3 of the Entra ID auth or the user context level auths, whether it's in Azure Files with the storage key, with the API with storage API, whether it's in Azure Files with SMB, that one's not storage file data privilege contributed, has SMB in the name. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. And then of course Blob has its own roles. So you've got to make sure you get the roles right if you're using Entra ID. Now the other option, if you're not doing it into the user context, is simply a connection string. You can go to, draw a total blank, security, networking, access keys, and get yourself a connection string, right? These are already be defined in here. You can copy these and actually put these into MyWorkDrive. Let me show you actually how that process works on the MyWorkDrive side. Let's make that easy. Let's go ahead and I'll show that one long enough to copy it. Of course, we'll wipe, like Dan said earlier, we'll wipe this out when we publish the video. But I want to create a new Azure file. I want to create a new share using Azure Files with connection string. So file share. Now, this is where I mentioned you don't actually have to go to integrations if you don't want to. You can actually do the integration work right from here. It'll show you your existing ones. We can add a new one. Kind of like Dan mentioned about things in your Azure tenant, we need to do a little bit of careful naming in here because we don't want these things to get confusing. We want to delete them. I mentioned you've got your choice here. I'll do an Entra ID one here in just a moment too. And then you simply drop your connection string in here. We're going to validate it. You saw we have a lot of validation and all these things. Try to make it easy for you to not set something up in a way that won't work and have yourself step back and say, well, what did I do wrong, or where is the error? Because there's a little bit of complexity to getting all this thing set up. So we added our connection string from Azure, and you don't have to create a new Azure storage account. Like, you didn't see me create that account. That account already existed. You can grab this for any account you already have. The key really is connection string, well, any of the Azure file share storage accounts. It's at the storage account level. Everybody has access, equivalent access, with connection string, with Entra ID mode, if they have their role in there, but there's no file and folder level permissioning with Azure Files, as Dan mentioned. I'm going to define who I want to give access to this. I'm going to use this simple group, so essentially anybody in my Entra ID who's a member, not a guest. Guest was, you saw separately on there. Guest was a separate option. We can talk about guests a little bit later on. We haven't had public sharing on. Public sharing is available in various options within the Azure Files and Azure Blob, but not in all of them. So you'll want to pay attention to that if you need to. If you're building this to support public sharing, there's some nuance there. And that's it, really. We're done. I guess I made it sound a little more difficult than it was. The key really is having Azure storage and having it configured the way you want. So let's add, let me show you what's a little bit different
and
about
that chart that we have too that Scott brought up earlier has specific instructions for setting up each storage, so you don't have to do it all from the video. But down at the bottom,
get into
there's links at the top that link down to each specific storage type, what roles they need. Right. So like if you're setting up I think it's going to do blob next, for example.
I want to do an EID real quick, just as an example. Let's do, now we don't have the one I want, so let's add a new one. AFS, because there is a little bit of difference. The Entra ID models don't have quite the same level of validation. We don't have the ability, because you're doing it in the context of the user, so we can't validate what you've set up because we're not in the user context in this administrative level. If you're using, this is a good time to point out that if you're using a VM in Azure and you have the ability to use managed identity, we support managed identity, so you can have that little bit of extra security of knowing that you're not potentially saving a connection string.
Yeah, that's important. A lot of people, you may not even know, but managed identity is a new feature that's available, and basically every resource in Azure has a managed identity, and so you can actually take the resource of your virtual machine. That managed identity can be given the rights for the storage contributor rights, and then that is then used to be able to browse out to that share and be able to do the checking to make sure it's valid. But so you'll still be logging in as users in most of those cases.
So you'll notice I'm prompted for my storage account name, so I had to pop back out to make sure I got the right one in Azure. And you can actually test this. We don't have that automated validation, the check mark, but you can go through a process where you sign into Azure. It's very similar to that process that Dan showed a minute ago, where you create that command line interface with the key code, and it spawned the extra browser window. I'm not going to take you all the way through that process. I just want you to know that is out here. If you're having any problems with your storage, or if this is the first time you've ever done it, you want to test it, you actually can. So now we've added that new integration for the EID new, but here's the second thing that, again, I can't look it up because I'm doing it in the context of Azure, so I actually have to have the file share name, which is simple from Azure. Just pop over here and look at what your storage is, and you can see my file share name in this case is share1. So you're just gonna copy and paste or type that into your setup here in the share. Now, you'll notice I've been ignoring, and I haven't mentioned at any point the subfolder path. But if your shares have subfolders, just like we support with NTFS, just like we support with the other things, like if I want to specifically target this subfolder for this share, I can do that. I can go right in here to folder 1. I could actually type that in here, and I can define that subfolder path. Not important, but just a feature if anyone happens to need it. And of course, I need to define who I'm going to make this available to. In this case, I can pick guests. Maybe in this case, maybe this is the share I'm allowing guest user access on, but maybe I want to limit the guest user access to certain functionality, whereas I'm going to give it to my own members of my account. Oh, and I already had one called AFS-EID, so it shows you that you can't create things. Got our validation is working in there. And that's all there is to adding an Azure file share, even with Entra ID, so not too hard. But let's talk a little bit about Blob. As Dan mentioned, I want to show you Blob, and there's something important I want to show you about in Blob, or talk about in Blob. Now, Blob works very similarly to Azure Files. I have a Blob storage account in here. The one thing that's important and different, well, there's really two things that are different. One, we don't just use connection strings. We also have the ability to use a SAS token, and you can create a SAS token with some limited rights. You have some additional abilities to define rights in here about whether you want them to have access to files and folders and what permissions you want them to have. So you can create a little bit of you can add a little bit of security with SAS token. The other thing that's important, and of course, make sure you set the appropriate expiry date before you create SAS. And I guess the other thing I would tell you is, well, we'll leave it as that just to make it simple. I didn't actually give them access to anything. We'll give them access to the container. Well, we'll give them access to everything. That's fine. There's two things that get created down here, a SAS token and a SAS URL, as well as connection strings and some other things. We very specifically use the SAS token, as you'll see in the configuration in a minute. So we'll go ahead and I don't need it right now. It doesn't matter. I'm actually not going to set up a SAS because you've already seen sort of the basic configuration of that. Now, the important thing that's different about Blob accounts is if you choose to, remember we had that chart earlier, and Dan talked briefly about the fact that if you want that ACL list, you've got to choose Blob storage, but you've got to choose it and have hierarchical namespace enabled. So when I look at my Blob configuration, it'll show you right on this overview page as soon as it loads for me if you have hierarchical namespace enabled. And in this case, I do. If you don't, this will be a hyperlink. This is a one-way upgrade. So if you don't have it enabled and you want it, you can turn it on. But if you have it, you can't turn it off. Okay, so be aware of that. But if I have hierarchical namespace enabled, I'll trip over that word. When I actually look at my access control list, I've got, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to go to it there. Let me actually show you really the finite level of it on the container itself. When you look at the container, you've got the ability to manage an access control list, and you've got now something that looks somewhat similar with permissions of read, write, and execute to what you get on NTFS, and you can define this by user. So here, domain user is a specific user account. Somebody actually set that up earlier. And we've given domain user very specific permissions. Of course, this could be a group. This could be a QA group or some other group of individuals and users you have in here. You can browse all your intergroups and give anybody you want access, right? So that exists, but you get that, and this is that granular level of permissions I mentioned. You get that with hierarchical namespace enabled on Blob. You don't get that option from Microsoft with Azure Files. And I just wanted to really quick go
Another
into one.
extinction is, Scott mentioned SAS token. You can also create a SAS token at the container level as well. So you don't have to create one for the entire storage account. When you're using Blob storage, you can generate a SAS like he's doing right there, right at the container level, right? So another way to kind of further lock it down. If you're fine with using a SAS token, you can do that. And of course, then the ultimate is data lake with hierarchical namespace,
Yeah,
managing
and I think
ACLs.
it's important that we make the distinction here that using a SAS token ignores the ACL. Using a SAS token gives everyone the rights you give the SAS token. You saw me a minute ago when I was generating that SAS token, choosing whether I could add read or write or container accounts or what. This interface looks a little bit differently, but it's essentially the same thing, right? What level of permissions am I giving? Who am I giving it permission to? That sort of thing. That eliminates the ACL. The ACL works when you have Entra ID identity enabled on that. The other thing I was going to point out about access control before I go back to that is you can manage access control at the file and folder level. So now I'm very specifically managing what's happening to this folder. And you'll notice domain user isn't here. We didn't give domain user permission to this folder. We gave permission to domain user at a higher level. So this is where you get into those granular controls in Microsoft, which the MyWorkDrive server will support when you choose to enable blob with Entra ID. And let me show you that real quick, because there's a little bit of configuration on that. Let's go ahead and add a new blob. I'm not actually going to go through all the way through it, so I don't need to worry about the fact that I didn't actually create one. We're going to add a provider, and what I want to make sure I do is, you'll notice you have the ability to choose, once you choose that you want to set it up with Entra ID, whether or not you want hierarchical namespace enabled or not. And that's important because Microsoft's connection to that blob storage is different. The underlying connection is slightly different with and without. So if you choose incorrectly, you'll get unusual behavior in there, if you will. Some things will work, some things won't. Deletes might work, creates might fail. So it's important that you set this to match the way that your storage account is set. If you have it enabled on the storage account, I'll go back to that overview screen so you can see that again. If you have hierarchical namespace enabled on your storage account, you'll want to make sure in MyWorkDrive that you choose with hierarchical namespace. And you'll see that the level is defined. If you do not have hierarchical namespace, you're just using it with Entra ID, just that role. Again, you've got to make sure that your users have roles on blob storage. Then it'll be at the share level. If you enable it with hierarchical space, then it's file and folder level, and you can use that ACL feature. Now, if you just choose connection string, that's again just file and folder level. Again, it's just a connection string like you saw me do with Azure Files. And if you choose SAS token, again, you have to define the storage account name. So, whatever your storage account name is in Azure, I forget what ours is, blob DLEID is the example I've been using. You copy and paste that. And then you'll drop that, like I mentioned, that SAS token URL, not the actual, that's kind of a misleading label there because we use the SAS token, not the URL. Anyway, you'll drop that. We'll have to edit that. You'll drop the value in here, and then essentially you have it all set up. You can define a share with it. Defining a share, whatever you choose to as your connection, is always going to be the same as just pick the appropriate storage account. There I have one with Data Lake. Here's one with Data Lake. These are the SAS at the storage or container level, or just purely Entra ID without Data Lake. You can define all those things, and it all works the same within here, whether or not you actually have to type the container name in, or whether we're able to look the container name up because we actually have permission to the account to do that, and the definition of your users. That's a lot. Everyone probably needs a break, but we talked about SMB. We talked about Azure Files. We talked about Azure Blob and the differences. The other two storage accounts you can have are the same as they were in 6.4, and that's OneDrive and SharePoint. I don't actually have OneDrive and SharePoint enabled on here. We can go ahead and set those up. We'll take a look at integrations. I do have an integration enabled for OneDrive. I do have an integration enabled for SharePoint. Take a look at settings. I might have them turned off over here. You've got the ability to turn, that's another point I should make, which is over here on settings, you've got the ability to turn these on and off at the global level. So if I don't want any of my Azure file shares to work, even though I have them set up in shares and I have integrations created for them, I can turn them on and off. So let's go ahead and go back over here and create a OneDrive. Okay, so OneDrive and SharePoint are here. I just wasn't looking in the right place. Again, creating them is exactly the same, except you don't have, for OneDrive, you don't have that granular permissions. And with SharePoint, just like we had in 6.4, you can choose to use your default SharePoint site, or you can disable that and you can define your site path and even a library or a subfolder within that. And of course, it'll prompt you to verify access before you do that. I'm not going to go through and do all that because I've shown you the same thing. We're getting it relatively redundant here. But essentially, that's the same thing. Define your users and groups, their actual permissions. OneDrive defining users and groups is somewhat immaterial because it's really their own OneDrive account. So you're not really securing anything. And of course, if you give access to a OneDrive account to someone who actually doesn't have one, they don't have a license, a Microsoft 365 or an Office 365 license and don't have a OneDrive account, that won't work. Again, underlying permissions always are going to prevail. So that's pretty much storage. Dan, anything else I should point out in here that you think I missed along the way?
No, I think that's great. Looking good. I think we've gone through a lot. Of course, again, we'll have all this stuff in support docs and links in the video as well. So you can check there to do a deeper dive as we progress through this. I can take over from here. Our
Pass to you
next
and let you do Office
module,
Online.
yes, is Office Online. So let's talk about that for a second before we get into that and actually look at it on a server. You can see that I brought up our support article on here. And you can go through there, and essentially we have multiple ways of being able to edit your files in Office Online through the MyWorkDrive clients by setting up that on your server. So we have the ability to do it in using SharePoint, using OneDrive, and we have a comparison chart here. So some customers, high security, they don't want any of their files ever leaving their premise at all. We do support Office Online local server. There's instructions and links here of how to set that up. You can go find that on the internet as well. You're supposed to have Office licenses to go along with that. And then the other option would be to use SharePoint. So what SharePoint does is rather than putting the file, essentially let's talk about for a minute how does it work with SharePoint and OneDrive. So the way it works with SharePoint and OneDrive is when a user clicks on a file to edit it in Office Online and one of those modes is selected, it will actually log in using, since the user, if it's not already logged in, they'll prompt them to log in to enter ID and Office Online. It'll move the file, temporary copy of the file to OneDrive or SharePoint, and then it'll keep that link and make that aware if anyone else wants to co-edit that file at the same time. The changes will be made there, either in OneDrive or in SharePoint. And then once they're done, it'll actually copy that file and move it back to the local on-premise. In the meantime, it'll be locked, so if anyone else goes through and wants to be able to edit it, they'll have to go through co-edit mode, or if they're in local office, they'll just get the normal, this file is locked. The difference between SharePoint and OneDrive is for some high security customers, they might not want to have that file live on one particular user's temporary OneDrive site. So in that case, you can set up SharePoint. There's it's another app registration that needs to be done to be able to do that. And that will essentially create, you'll have a site that you create that's in SharePoint that the file will be placed on. And we have all instructions on here on how to do all that. That's essentially, there's a separate article just for setting up the SharePoint site, and there's permissions that are required. We do have a number of customers doing that when they have a high security scenario. The default option is OneDrive. You can use the MyWorkDrive app registration that already exists. You just approve that, and it just works out of the box. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up on a server and just to show what it looks like from an admin panel perspective. So this is the server that I was up on earlier. It's clean. Server hasn't even really been set up yet. We did accept some defaults on there. So if I go look at integrations, we're going to see that we have some different options available to us when it comes to being able to do Office Online editing. So if I scroll down here to Office Online editing providers, you can see we have OneDrive, SharePoint, OnlyOffice, or Local Office Server. If I modify the settings here, you can see that we've got OneDrive here, and we've used an individual connection. This is the same one that when we created that for you, it's that same one that you use for Azure AD. In this case, the same application secret that we're going to remove before we post this video is in here. This is your own app, right? Because you had us create that, and that box was checked during that app registration. If you were doing an Active Directory mode and you selected it, you would most likely just be using the MyWorkDrive hosted app, and there'd be nothing there to really do except to approve it. And set that it's allowed. So that's what OneDrive looks like. That's the default. The next option would be to do SharePoint. I'm not going to go through a complete video on all of that. But again, you would need to be able to set up the SharePoint site. We have, there's quite a number of steps to do that, and you can work with our support department on that. Same thing with OnlyOffice. That's more of a WAPI style protocol. You set up your own server, similar to setting up the local Office or Office Online server, which a number of our customers do, where they don't want to have that file ever go out to the internet at all. So once that's done, then you can see there's, as Scott mentioned, we do have some settings to turn things off or on as well. So Office Online Edit does require, if when you're using OneDrive, the ability to use our reverse proxy mechanism to make that site available, so that you'll notice that these connections are tested and looked at a little bit differently. So that's an important piece on that. And you can see if I scroll down to Office Online Editing, you have the different options here in terms of what you would use. In this case, we're using OneDrive. You can also, turn some features on here in terms of what you want to allow to happen, whether or not if you want to allow people to do local web edit, that's a little bit different. That's actually opening a document in local Office installation through the browser and doing the edit that way rather than requiring the MapDrive client. And then you can also decide what you want to have happen related to Office Online. Double click. If someone double clicks on an Office file in Office Online, it'll either open up directly in our viewer, editing directly in Office Online, download, or open locally. And we even give you the ability to use, an Office Web Apps viewer or the local viewer that comes with the MyWorkDrive server. So there's a number of options. Even without Office Online editing enabled, we do have viewers as well. So if you just want to be able to have users to be able to view stuff, that is an option as well. The next section I'm going to go through quickly is just device approval. So we do have the ability to do device approval, and to turn that, we have first of all have to turn that feature on. So if you want to enable device approval, we support it for the MapDrive and the mobile client. So you would just simply turn it on. And now anybody that wants to connect with the MapDrive client, they're going to get a code when they try to log in saying, hey, you're not able to log in until your device is approved. That code will be there for them to be able to send it to the administrator. And then that'll also show up, that user will also show up here. You can just compare or search for that code and approve them through here as well. And we also support that same thing through the mobile as well. So in that case, they won't be able to use either of those clients unless that device is already approved. They would be able to still use the web client. And within that, you can do further blocking, putting things in to be able to determine whether or not they're even able to download files and things like that. So to further protect your data, we also have the ability to turn on data leak prevention. So we can, in this case, put on the ability to allow them to view stuff that uses the viewer, which blocks the clipboard. It also can put a watermark across the file. So if you have users that you want to be able to get onto certain shares where you want to use data leak prevention, maybe these are guest users that you want to be able to have them be able to see stuff but not download it. Even if they took a screenshot, it's going to have a big watermark across it. This is where you would go to enable that. You can also, there's some different options here. You can change what the confidential marking is that is across there at all. You can turn off the ability to download files through SMB shares. There's a little pop-up that will pop up. You can turn off that if you don't want that. You can also, but you can put in an exception here to allow them to edit an Office online. So, you know, it's not going to be easy for them to be able to download the file. It's just going to be, it still would be possible, but those casual leaving of files in places you don't want are pretty much going to be stopped. So if you have a real high level of security, that probably might not be something you want to do. But if you're working with a semi-trusted group of users and you want to allow them to be able to do, you know, quick edits and things like that, for that kind of a workflow, that's what that's there for. So once I enable that, then when I go to actual shares, I'll have the ability to make some changes related to that share with data leak prevention. Notice download came up here. Office Online came up here as new options here. And notice here I can actually specify by user group of that I've configured on the share who's able to download. So if I uncheck download, now that user, when they log into the web client or the MapDrive client, they're going to be able to see the file, but they can't download it. And even through the MapDrive client. So the MapDrive client will allow them to be able to view that file, but they won't be able to download that file. And that's pretty much it for those basic settings.
Yeah, data leak prevention, long-standing feature we've had for a really long time. Device approval we added 4 or 5 versions ago, relatively unchanged. In version 7, support carries forward if you already have them deployed in an earlier version as they're upgrading, or if you're deploying them, they work the same. And again, all that documentation is in our support library, and we'll link those in the, we have a lot of links in the video description, but we'll link those in the video description, calling those things out specifically. I have a couple other things I want to take from Dan just to kind of wrap up some of the other things that are common, right? Device approval, data leak prevention, Office Online setup. These things are all common. Doesn't really matter which version of the software you're using, whether it's you know, really 6.4 or 7, or whether it's 7 with Active Directory or 7 with Entra ID modes. A couple of things I want to talk about. One that we get a lot of interest in is public sharing. Public sharing is that, let me get a screen share going here so you guys can see what I'm talking about. Public sharing is that ability for users to generate a link that you can send outside of your organization. And it's a link to, it's a hyperlink, it's a link to a web page, and users can then access these files. Maybe they can only download them, maybe they can upload to the share, maybe they're in view only mode. But it's that really cool tool. We had a lot of requests for this. We had a lot of interest in this from the sales organization of customers saying, I really like that very simple, basic public sharing. Of course, we still have our guest user access. Talk about that in a minute. Our more invasive or more advanced public sharing, public sharing, I shouldn't use that term, but our more advanced share option that you can use. But that basic public sharing. Now, going along with that really basic, and public sharing is available to end users from the web client and the install clients, the MapDrive client for Mac and Windows. They can generate a public share link. But, along with, hey, I'd really like that feature, the other request we get very often is, but I need a lot of security around that feature. Maybe I don't want certain users to have it. Maybe I don't want it to exist for certain shares. And all of that permissioning exists for you. From the public sharing tab, you can choose whether, we also include the OneDrive and Outlook sharing. These are API integrations specifically exclusively in the web client to allow you to push data out of MyWorkDrive into OneDrive or Outlook, the user's OneDrive or the user's Outlook, again, under the context of the user. But public sharing, you have the ability to enable that or not. So if you're in a sensitive environment with sensitive documents, lots of PII or regulatory requirements, turn it off. Just don't enable public sharing at all. Of course, you can see the links that were already created. You can manipulate them if you want. But if you do want it on, why turn it on? And then you've got all these different controls on here. How long they're allowed to exist? How long do you keep them after they expire in case users need to re-enable them? Are passwords required? Passwords are always an option. Users can put in a password, but you can choose to force users to password protect those things. Again, they're just, as you saw me show at the very top, it's just a web link. So if you don't have a password on it, whoever you send this to just has access to these files. But again, within the constraints you set, limiting the ability to download some other things here. And of course, you can also see and manipulate what shares have been created. So on this server, a couple different users have created a number of public shares. I can help them with that. I can give them back the link. I can go into an edit mode and say, you know what, I know this person needs to extend this. Let me go ahead and extend this out for them. Or I know they meant to put a password on it. Let me put a password on it, that sort of thing. So you can correct those things. Now, that's not just at the macro level, at the absolute share level, or at the configuration level at the server level. You also have within shares, as part of our granular permission system, the ability to choose whether it's on for a given share or not. And if you have multiple users or groups in here, whether or not they can access it or not. So this is not a great example because I only have one thing, but let's add a second group in here real quick. And you'll see it's off by default for this, which is fine in this case. Maybe that's what I want, or maybe I want it to reverse. You have that level of granular control at the administrative level to choose who gets to even use the feature. And then again, within the context of, and what are they required to do when they do it? One last quick note about public sharing, and that is specific to the new features within version 7. Not all storage types or access methods to storage, I should say, support public sharing the same way. And that's because the way public sharing is created is either via a delegation link. So if you're using Active Directory, you're required to configure delegation on these shares, kind of like we talked about when we were talking about share setup and using a SAML SSO. In the Azure world, they're done using SAS tokens, right? Individual SAS tokens created in the context or by that user. But since sometimes users don't have that permission, some share types require you to use managed identity. So if you refer to our article, pull that article up here real quick, you'll see that we actually call out on that article I mentioned earlier with the grid with all the different Azure file storage options. We call out what's required to use public sharing. Now, public sharing is available in all cases, but in some cases it might require an Azure VM with managed identity. So that might also be a consideration for you when you're making shares available, what access method you use, whether it's connection string or SAS token or Entra ID mode or what. So something else to consider. Again, we'll link this article out there. So that's public sharing. Let me also talk for a minute just about a number of other settings on the server that are relatively unchanged and still exist. I've mentioned a few times, and I just want to bring it up again, the fact of our granular permissions. Let me actually do it on this other server because this other server has a bigger granular permissions list on some of these shares because this is an Active Directory server. We've still got the granular permissions and the ability control, as you saw Dan a moment ago when he enabled Office Online and download when you enable data leak prevention. All of these permissions still exist. So you've got that very granular ability to, as we talked about earlier, remove access from users and groups. And it's called granular permissions because it's granular. I don't want this particular set of users to get on the mapper client. I don't want this group of users to be able to download things. I don't want that group of users to be able to do public sharing. And this user themselves like can't do anything but maybe just sign in on the web client, right? So you've got that granular permission functionality, really important from a security standpoint. Carrying on with that security standpoint is an activity log and an audit history of everything that the user does. 3 ways really to get at that information. We log all user activities under the Logs tab. This is a text-based list. It just appears here. Users, you can see this is a busy server. It's got 300 pages of, Ricardo and others trying to do things, Samantha and things like that, right? So you have this data. It's always in the server. We keep 30 days history by default. You can adjust the retention level. You may also choose not to keep it in the MyWorkDrive server. You might choose to enable a syslog integration to your SIM and push this data over there. So you don't have to depend on MyWorkDrive to store this data. You can push that out. Very simple setup, the host name or IP address of your SIM and the port you're using and what protocol you want. That's all it takes. This is a couple clicks to set that all up. So you can do that over there. And then the third component to our logging is the alerting system, which if you're using your SIM, you'll probably write your own alerts around. But if you're not using a SIM and you want a little bit of backup around that, we've got the ability to define an email-based, this is a from and to email-based, right, potentially uses a 587 or TLS or SSL type host, but you'll get emails. You can set it up. Essentially, it's amount of activities in a given period of time. So 20 files are downloaded by a user in 5 minutes. You'll get an email about that. 10 files are deleted in 5 minutes by a user. You'll get an email. And the email has the user's name. Again, pushing to a SIM, obviously much more advanced controls of thresholds and notification methods, whether you're pushing to a Slack channel or you're using Teams or you're sending a text message, whatever, but different options for audit history and logging. And again, their retention levels. And if you need to store those text files, know in the back of your head that there are text files on the MyWorkDrive server. We have plenty of clients who are sweeping those into cold storage, just a simple copy job to keep them for whatever their retention period is, be that a business requirement or a regulatory requirement for the environment they operate in. So just know that exists. If you need help with that, reach out to support. We'll be happy to help you. A couple more small things to talk about. I mentioned when I was talking about public sharing our guest user access functionality. That only exists in Active Directory mode because it is a subcomponent of your Entra ID sign-in because it uses Microsoft's B2B process. We have a long article about this on our support site. I don't want to go through the whole thing right now. I just wanted to really tell you that it still exists if you're using Active Directory mode, if you're upgrading from it, or if you have a need for it. The core difference between public sharing and guest user access, public sharing, you're individually sending out a link to a folder or a particular file even. You can get to granular to that level. Guest user access, you're inviting a third party to collaborate at the share level using their own Microsoft account. The examples I typically give for this that I've seen out in our customer environments are, I'm working with a third-party marketing company who's doing a series of collateral for me over the course of months to years because they're working on an advertising campaign or they're helping me prepare documentation for some sort of marketing program, right? So I'm working with 3 or 4 people. They need access to my marketing share, or I create a marketing share for this collaboration. And I don't want to have to give them user accounts, right? I don't have to create user 1 at company.com, user 2 at company.com. I'm just going to invite their Microsoft account so they can sign in with familiar credentials. That's the real big difference in public sharing is sort of longer term engagements, more consistent access, more high level access versus I'm just sending them a quick link. So enough about guest user access. If you need it, it's there. And of course, with Entra ID mode, you can guess, you've seen us as we've set this thing up. We haven't really talked about it in detail. At least I haven't. The fact that when you edit this, one of the options that you can add is Entra ID guest users. Well, the MyWorkDrive software will immediately detect if someone is an invited guest in your tenant, and you can grant access broadly to all invited guests. That might be a little bit dangerous if you have a lot of invited guests, but you could do that, of course. And then your guests show up in the list. I don't have any guests just in this top 100 to show you just off the top of my head. Most of them are all groups. But if you invited a guest, why that guest would show up in here, and you can just manually add them case by case. So you don't even need the guest invite
Yeah, you
software. You
can
can just
do the
enable
guest
them right
user
here.
invites directly in the Azure portal, right? Just
Correct.
invite
Yep.
them right from there if you want. Yeah. So it's
Yep.
sort
I
of
don't have to.
integrated directly. The difference is the Active Directory mode. It's like, as Scott mentioned, it's doing the B2B process, which means we basically have to create dummy accounts in Active Directory and mirror those accounts to what's out as guest accounts in Azure AD. And it's all part of the Microsoft standard process for B2B.
Oh, I'm signed into the wrong tenant, so I probably can't do this. But this is what I'm talking about is when I'm inviting an external user, right? In Azure, this is exactly what we're talking about. Is this thing here? Two last things just to wrap up in this sort of miscellaneous settings, and I'll talk about the health dashboard, which is at the bottom of the menu here. In Active Directory mode, we support the concept of previous versions. So you'll see a toggle for that in settings, the ability to enable previous versions. And what that is an integration with volume shadow copy. I didn't scroll far enough because I got too busy talking, but it's an integration with volume shadow copy so that users in the web client can actually retrieve those copies in essence to recover lost work or restore previous versions. That exists in Active Directory mode, and it only exists for SMB storage. It doesn't exist for OneDrive and SharePoint. We haven't integrated anything like that, but that's out there if you're using it or want to use it. That still exists, and the last thing I'll mention, it actually has a subtle change to it in 6.4.2, and that's our clustering functionality. Now, clustering is really confusing, and I definitely encourage you to reach out to support, review the support articles we have on this, and reach out to support before you consider doing anything with clustering, because clustering is a functionality of, essentially, there's 3 tiers to it. There's clustering the configuration files, there's clustering sessions and locks for co-editing across nodes, and then there's, of course, publishing behind a load balancer. MyWorkDrive handles the first 2 of those options. The potential to cluster config files, which is not required, it's optional. The ability to cluster sessions and locks, which you can do independent as of 6.4.2. You'll see sessions and locks as separate from the actual configuration files. And then, of course, publishing is not handled by MyWorkDrive at all, as Dan and I have both mentioned at different times during this call. Publishing your server to end users, I think Dan specifically used the phrase, it's an IIS website. You can publish it any way you want. There's lots of methods to do that. Behind a load balancer in a multi-node scenario is one of those. We do have some documentation on doing that with various methods. Azure Load Balancer, Nginx, Azure App Gateway, a couple different options. So, but the key I wanted to point out is that clustering is still an available feature with Active Directory mode. And we have now separated the ability to change sessions and locks from sync settings. And why that's important, we have customers, the sync setting share path is a shared SMB path, right? Or a shared disk if you're in a virtual environment and can share disks like up in Azure. We have customers who say, I don't want to do that. I don't want to share the disk. I don't want a shared configuration standpoint, but I still want to be able to enable the clustering of sessions and locks so my user can co-edit documents. When Dan talked about enabling Office Online and the options for co-editing, I want them to be able to co-edit, and of course I want them to be able to do it across nodes, right? If I offline node 1, I want people to I want to funnel sessions to node 2, and I want those users to be able to continue to co-edit with users on node 3. So we've added the ability for customers to do that. That's actually something that's new in 6.4.2, late 6.4.2, and then version 7. The very last piece to talk about, I thank everyone who's stuck it out here, and if you've jumped around in chapters, you've reached the last one, is our health dashboard. And the health dashboard is something we added, 3 or 4 versions ago, and it continues to evolve. Essentially, it's a snapshot not just of the MyWorkDrive software, but also the environment in which MyWorkDrive is running. you'll notice that we're talking about disk I/O. We're talking about, is the Cloudflare port open? Are individual services we use up? What's the health of the machine look like? In this case, the VM I'm sharing is a little short on disk space, so I'm going to have problems with Windows updates, and my disk I/O might be a little bit slow. Although, don't hyperfixate on your disk I/O, because disk I/O tends to underreport on virtual machines, both Hyper-V or the other virtualization software on-prem, and then also up in Azure and AWS and other cloud storage providers. So don't overfixate on that, but definitely you can run yourself out of disk space, particularly if you run a long log retention and don't have a good sweep set up. Or just are thin provisioning things. So Health Dashboard is really helpful, more so to us from a quick view standpoint when we engage with you on a support need, but also something you might look at if you have some anomalies in your environment of users reporting some odd behavior. You might take a look at this just to see if everything is good. And of course, I would key in on the red ones. Those are problems. Nothing on here really should be red. If the feature that's not enabled, like you don't see the LDAP, like we have the ability to show LDAP if you're in Active Directory mode, like if it doesn't show up, you don't need it. So if there's something red, that's a concern for you. But essentially, that's kind of some of the shared features for you, and really what I wanted to share with you on the server side.
Right, and it's nice to be able to see the history on some of that stuff too, right? Even though right at the moment it might look good, support might ask you, let's just scroll back and see if we had any lot of disk I/O at a certain time, right? So that helps us to be able to help you be able to track down bottlenecks as well. Great. I think that's the end of our server setup video. Thanks for sticking with us. We'll be continuing to refine and update this video as time goes on.